few years ago, I was working at a mall in a department store located near the center. It was usually quite busy, and I had been there for several years. Among the employees, there was an ongoing joke about a mysterious figure we called the Faded Man. Several workers and even some shoppers had reported seeing him, a tall, shadowy figure with his face obscured, lurking around after hours or in eerie spots during the day. However, no one had any solid proof, which made it even stranger. One of my friends, Kevin, who worked as a security guard, claimed he had seen the man on surveillance footage a couple of times. But the footage was off-limits without special clearance, so none of us could verify it. Even Kevin admitted that trying to zoom in on the man's face was nearly impossible due to the poor quality of the cameras. Many of us thought it was just an urban legend. I was skeptical myself, having never seen him, though a part of me always wondered if he was real. Then one night, everything changed. It was right before closing time, and I was working the last shift. Most of my co-workers had already left, leaving just my manager, Tony, and me to finish up. Out of nowhere, I had this unsettling feeling like someone was watching me. I instinctively looked around but saw nothing. Convinced it was just my imagination, I turned back to my work until I noticed something in my peripheral vision. A tall figure stood near the storage room door, partially hidden in the shadows. His face was mostly covered, and he towered at about 6 feet 6 inches. My heart pounded as I realized he was real. I gasped, frozen in fear, and stammered as I called out. Tony rushed over, alarmed, asking what was wrong. I could barely speak. I just pointed. Tony had never seen him either, but without hesitation he shouted, "The mall is closed. You need to leave." The tall man didn't respond. He didn't even move. Then he took a single step toward us. That was enough to send me into a full panic. My breathing became erratic. This was a man who had been rumored to vanish in an instant, and now he was right in front of us. As Tony and I instinctively backed away, the man suddenly turned his head to the side, as if he saw something unseen. Then, without warning, he bolted. I was too scared to move, but Tony, acting on instinct, took off after him. Not wanting to be left alone, I followed, chasing after them toward the back of the store. My hands trembled as we searched between stacks of boxes in the dimly lit storeroom. Suddenly, Tony darted down an aisle and disappeared into the darkness. I was alone again. A sudden crash made me spin around. A box had fallen to my right, and there he was, standing even closer than before. This time I saw his face more clearly. He looked to be around 40 years old, extremely tall with long, unkempt hair and a thick beard. But his eyes, they were empty, filled with something dark and unsettling. He took a slow step toward me, and I felt paralyzed by pure terror. Then Tony shouted my name. I turned toward him in relief, but when I looked back, the man was gone. I had no idea if he had vanished into thin air or if my mind had imagined the whole thing. I was too terrified to think straight. My head spun and I nearly passed out. We searched for a while longer but found nothing, not a single clue. When we checked the surveillance footage, we discovered that the entire incident had happened in a blind spot, almost as if he knew exactly where the cameras couldn't see. For days, I couldn't sleep. I kept wondering if he had followed me home, lurking somewhere in the shadows. The fear consumed me. Eventually, I had to take time off work just to recover from the trauma. Weeks later, he was finally caught. One night, Tony spotted him again and, instead of chasing him, immediately called the police. This time, officers combed through the area and made a chilling discovery. A hidden crawl space in the ceiling turned into a makeshift living area. According to the news, the man had been living there for nearly a year. No details about his identity or how he ended up in the mall were ever released, only that he remained in custody for questioning. After that, I quit my job. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that store again, knowing what had happened there. I don't live too far from a huge mall, which is convenient because I can do almost all my shopping there. Other than basic necessities and groceries, I usually buy everything else at the mall. I remember one time last year when I went there in the late afternoon. I spent quite a bit of time shopping, and as usual, the mall was crowded with people. By the time I left, it was already night, and things had quieted down compared to when I first arrived. The mall has a large parking garage attached to it, along with additional parking outside. That day, I had parked on the third level of the parking structure. As I walked towards my car, I noticed a young woman on crutches heading in my direction. She greeted me, saying hi, and I instinctively responded the same way. I didn't recognize her and wasn't sure why she was speaking to me. As she got closer, just as I was about to get into my car, she asked if I could give her a ride to her car. She explained that she had parked on another level, but mistakenly thought it was this one. Since walking was difficult for her with crutches, she needed help finding her car. She didn't seem suspicious, and I felt like I'd be a jerk if I refused. So I told her to get in. She placed her crutches in the back seat while I loaded my shopping bags. Then we both got in. I asked if she remembered which level she had parked on, but she wasn't sure, only that it was lower. She mentioned she wasn't from the area and wasn't used to large parking lots. At first, she was friendly and polite as I slowly drove down to the next level. We circled the entire second level of the parking structure, but she remained quiet. After checking every aisle, I asked if anything looked familiar, but she said no. So I continued down to the ground level. After another 5 minutes of searching, she still couldn't find her car. It seemed bizarre to me. How could someone forget where they parked this badly? There weren't even many cars left at this hour, making it easier to spot. Eventually, she said she might have actually parked outside the parking garage nearby. That struck me as odd. How could she mistake the parking structure for an outdoor lot? Still, I didn't say anything and kept driving. Once we left the garage, she suddenly remembered where her car was. She told me to drive around the corner and turned right, leading us to a smaller, more secluded lot surrounded by trees and positioned next to the parking structure. This lot was typically used for overflow parking during busy times. When I pulled in, I noticed it was dimly lit. Sitting alone in the far corner next to a tree was an old black four-door sedan, likely around 20 years old. The woman pointed to it and said it was hers, instructing me to park right next to it. She thanked me for the ride, and I was relieved she had finally found her car, though I was still confused about how she had forgotten parking here in the first place. I pulled up beside her car and she got out. She walked to my back seat, opened the door, and reached in for her crutches. But just as she grabbed them, I suddenly heard footsteps approaching from behind my car. In my mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement, but it was dark and happened so fast that I couldn't process what was going on. Before I knew it, someone was opening the back door on my driver's side. Instantly, I knew this was bad. My immediate reaction was to hit the gas. I was parked up against a curb with grass and trees in front of me, with little space to maneuver. I turned the wheel and accelerated, my car jumping the curb and briefly running over the grass. I swerved left, away from the man trying to enter my car and the woman as well. In the brief moment I saw him, I realized he was holding on to my door, trying to either stop me or get inside. He ran alongside my moving car, but after I made it off the curb and back onto the lot, I was able to speed up. He had no choice but to let go. I drove as fast as I could, putting distance between us. The problem was, the parking lot didn't have an exit in the direction I had gone. I had to turn around. When I did, I saw the man running toward me, with the woman close behind, except now she wasn't using her crutches at all. Her injury had been fake. She had set me up. I floored it toward the exit, barely making it out before they could reach me. As I sped away, I heard them yelling and cursing. As soon as I was safely out, I called the police and reported what had happened. I'm almost certain they got out of there before the cops arrived. Looking back, I'm just grateful I got away unharmed. I won't be giving rides to strangers again. One childhood trip to the mall remains unforgettable. I had just turned 7, and my mother took me and my 2 younger sisters there for some shopping. I always loved visiting the mall because it had so many different stores, making it much more exciting than a single shop. On that particular day, the mall was unusually crowded. We wandered around while my mother focused on my younger sisters. After about an hour, we stopped because my sister's shoe had come untied. At the time, my sisters were only 3 and 5 years old. While my mother knelt to tie the shoe, I stepped away slightly to look into a store window. I must have been gone for around 30 seconds. At least, that's how it felt. But when I turned back, my mother was no longer there. Looking back, I'm not sure if I went to the right bench where my mother had been sitting, or if I accidentally walked to a different one. The mall had multiple benches scattered throughout the large walkways, and many of them looked similar. Given how crowded the mall was, I must have gone to the wrong one. I searched everywhere, but my mother and sisters were nowhere to be seen. Panic set in. I thought they had left without me. Desperately, I started walking quickly through the mall, scanning the crowd for my mother. But the longer I walked, the more lost I became. Soon, I didn't even recognize where I was. I anxiously examined every passerby, hoping to spot my mother's familiar face, but she was nowhere to be found. After about 20 minutes of wandering, an older woman with dark hair and glasses approached me. She asked if I was lost, and I said yes. She reassured me that she would help me find my mother and told me to follow her. I felt relieved and believed her. As we walked, I had no sense of direction. I didn't know the layout of the mall well at all. Eventually, we reached a hallway leading toward the exit doors. The woman continued walking, heading straight for them. That's when confusion struck me. Why were we leaving? I knew my mother wouldn't just walk out of the mall without me. I hesitated and asked the woman why we were going outside. She claimed my mother had left and that she knew where to find her. But I didn't believe her. Just as we reached the doors, a mall security guard approached. He asked the woman who she was to me. She didn't respond and just stood there. Then the guard informed her that I had been reported missing. He pulled out his walkie-talkie and began speaking into it. At that moment, the woman turned abruptly and walked out of the doors, leaving the mall in a hurry. The security guard stayed with me and told me to wait by the entrance. My mother would arrive soon. Within 5 minutes, she appeared. Apparently, she had been searching everywhere and had alerted mall security earlier, describing my appearance and clothing. Other security guards had also been notified, and while my mother searched, they monitored the exits. That's when the guard noticed the woman, who clearly wasn't my mother, attempting to leave with me. I'm incredibly grateful to that security guard. If it weren't for him, I don't know what could have happened. The police were called, but beyond that, I don't remember much else. That trip to the mall was definitely one I will never forget.